Okay, so today I'm going over a couple of rules that took me absolutely forever to finally wrap my head around when I was getting into Warhammer 40k. Now, these rules, I believe, some you may find very interesting, and some you might be, what the heck are you talking about, you stupid retard? But these rules are the rules that confused me, and I'm trying to see if anyone else was confused by them. So I'm simply making a video expressing why I found them confusing and explaining them to you in the most simplistic way I physically can. Now, I don't think these rules are horrendously complex. They're not like new breaching rule games. They're just simply rules that may not have been taught to me enough, or I might not have had as much exposure to it as I would have liked when I was, just trying to figure out Warhammer. And this might be this might be you too. You might be looking through, trying to figure out what these rules mean, can't find them, and having a hard time understanding exactly what they mean. So I'm going to be going over 4 rules that I believe are talked about, but not talked about enough to maybe make clear for people like me, and I'm a special exception, but mainly for people like you, who might be a little bit curious on what these rules mean if you're starting out Warhammer, or maybe really experienced and want to know more about them. But yeah, let's just jump straight into it with what the heck I'm talking about when I say confusing rules. Now, the very first rule that absolutely confused me out of my head was the Scout X rule. Now, the reason I believe that this was just went over my head is simply because of the lack of exposure I had to it. If you think about it, Scout is very organized towards direct units. Think about it: the Scout Marines, the Zogrog, Wartsnagger, and Gretchens, the Votan Bikers, all of them are specifically built around the whole fact that they have Scout in the first place, and unless you're including them in your list, it's very hard to understand what it means, considering it's basically a whole rule part of a game in itself. And if I'm going to be honest, another one was I was explained so many different variations of what Scout X was that it just boggled my mind to the point where I was so confused what it actually means. I was told that first it's an addition to your regular movement, so you get to move the X movement and then your regular movement, and then I was told that it's when you get to move in your enemy's phase. And so I was told so many different things and thrown all over the place until eventually Happy Crump and Wargaming made an absolutely awesome video explaining what the heck Scout exactly was and, well, how it's implied in a direct stance. And I just want to give this out because Happy Crump and Wargaming, thank you so much. I love that man. Go check him out if you haven't already. Now, what is Scout? For all the people who don't know, let me explain it to you right here so you have to do no more research in itself. Basically, Scout is a pre-game ability. So this means before any game is started, any round is started, this move is applied. So basically, once you've decided who is going first, and you have deployed all of your units right before the start of the first battle round, you are allowed to reposition a specific unit by the X value of Scout it has. So, for example, my Zogrog Wartsnagger. Zogrog Wartsnagger gives the Scout 9 ability when he's leading the Gretchens. So this means, straight after we've deployed our units, and if I was going first, or they were going first, right before we declared the very first command phase, I would be allowed to reposition Zogrog Wartsnagger and the Gretchens 9 inches away from where they originally were, basically making a normal move of 9 inches right before the very first command phase is made. Now, if you both have Scout, basically you just take turns. Like every other rule in Warhammer, whether that be shooting or specific other mechanics that work in with each other, like if you both have some kind of ability to contradict each other, then simply you take turns. Whoever goes first gets to Scout first, and then the other person who goes second gets to Scout second. Pretty straightforward, pretty simple. That is Scout in a nutshell, and you have to do no more research into this painful rule. But let's find out what else is a bit painful in my life. Rule that absolutely stumped me on my journey to learning this silly game in itself is Big Guns Never Tire. Now, the reason I believe that this rule was so confusing for me, and while many other armies learned this very early on, is because simply, unlike other armies like Votan or Tau or Space Marines that actually have a lot of independence and requirements through vehicles and monsters, well, not monsters, but more vehicles, Orcs don't. Orcs simply rely very heavily on infantry, battle line, and a tiny bit of mounted. And our vehicle and monster count, while still valuable, is not necessarily as large and as broad as other armies would be. And then the amount of units in our index that need to shoot as a vehicle is even lower. So this rule for me never really occurred or never really just was brought up because a situation never really arose where the rule would needed to be played in. So I just believe that the lack of exposure I had to this rule was one of the big reasons I just never really got around to learning it or had experience of it in the first place. And the second one is that this rule is what I call a side rule. Now, I don't really mean that they're a discarded rule or they're unnecessary. I mainly mean similar to plunging fire, but obviously a bit better than plunging fire, is that they're not talked about as much as like stealth or lone operative or the battle rounds or deployment or deep strike or anything like that. They're kind of swept into the mat a little bit, and they get talked about sometimes in plays, but when you're learning the game, you don't really get Big Guns Never Tire included in it. So it could also just be a lack of exposure through that. So it was more just an ability that I never really came from because it was just never talked about and I never needed to talk about it. So it was a little bit unlucky for me. But all the people who want to use it and have no idea what it means, what is Big Guns Never Tire? Basically, in Warhammer 40k right now, if you are in engagement range with another enemy unit, you are not able to shoot the engaged unit or shoot out of the engagement. However, if you are a monster or vehicle, you are able to shoot in the engaged fight, and you are able to shoot out of the engaged fight. The only downside is in regular engagement shooting, a unit is not able to shoot another unit that is engaged. But if you are a monster or vehicle, you are able to be shot even when you're engaged. But the only downside to everything I just said is that if you shoot in engagement range, shoot out of engagement range, or a shot in through engagement range, it is a -1 to hit effect. So that means if I had a Rhino and I was being targeted by a bunch of Hormagaunts or Termagaunts or whatever you want to imagine, and I was in engagement range with them, I would be able to shoot into the Hormagaunts or Termagaunts or whatever you want to think it is, and I would be able to have a -1 to hit effect. And if there was another squad of Hormagaunts shooting into me, they would be allowed to shoot into me, but they would get a -1 to hit. And same with me, I would be allowed to shoot into them, but I would also get a -1 to hit effect. Now, this is basically how it works, and what sucks most about this rule is that when my Tau friend found out about this rule, whose army is basically entire vehicles, it really sucked for me. So I would recommend, if you have a Tau friend who doesn't know this rule, do not tell them the rule because it absolutely sucks. But yeah, that's Big Guns Never Tire, and let's move on to another painful rule that I had to suffer through. The third rule that really stumped me, and might be a little bit surprising to most of you, is Invulnerable Saves. Now, I know this sounds a bit silly because Invulnerable Saves are quite well known and are told through you in basically all of the basic guides and the core rulebook and the Warhammer app. But for me, you gotta remember, I'm stupid. So when I was doing my research, I was just seeing, oh, look at this cool little number. And because basically when I was starting to build, all the units that I was building off didn't have invulnerable saves, I basically just ignored it. And when I eventually moved on to things like Mozrog, or Warboss in Mega Armor, or the War, especially with the War, and I have an invulnerable save in the War, and I was so confused what invulnerable save meant, and I just didn't get it, so I just skipped over it. I was like, oh, okay, it's a cool, funny number that represents something that I'm not aware about. But I finally figured out what it is, and I learnt about it a long, long time ago when a friend of mine, basically we were playing some of our first games, he explained to me, oh, you know that number isn't just for effects, right? And I was like, really? And he explained to me what an invulnerable save was. And for anyone who doesn't know, I'm going to explain it right here. Basically, when a save turn is basically organized. So example, if you had to save on a 4, you had to save on a 5, or you had to save on a 3, whatever you had to save on, if you have an invulnerable save, you are now able to choose between the save value you've been allocated and the save value that your invulnerable save has. So for example, Mozrog Scragbad. Let's just say Mozrog was fired into with an AP -2 weapon. He would now have to save on a 5 up. But I have I think it is a 4 up invulnerable save. So I can now choose to save on a 4 except for saving on a 5. So this allows me to get that 1 extra save, which is just a little bit better in the end. But yeah, that's invulnerable saves. This rule is just stupid to me. I bet you already know it as it is, like most players do, but just keep in mind that I'm absolutely stupid. But yeah, let's move on to the final rule that I was confused about. The very last rule that stumped me was the extra attacks rule. Now the problem is this wording makes no sense. You gotta imagine, I was not in the Warhammer brain. I was in the basic brain. So when I heard extra attacks, I thought, oh, it means more. If you go on Google, the dictionary, and look up extra, it literally means more. So I went on and basically just said, okay, well, I'll give Mozrog 2 extra attacks for his extra thing. I'll give anything that has extra attacks 2. And I was just assuming and guessing, and I couldn't really understand because the wording of it was like, I didn't get it. So I was just like, okay, extra means more, so I add more. And that was stupid, and I'll explain to you why. Basically, in 10th edition, right now, this is a rule that many people don't know, but I'll explain to you now. If you are in engagement range, you are only allowed to select one melee weapon to attack with. So if you have 2 melee weapons, you have to choose one to attack with. This is a rule that has been written, I believe it's been in 8th and 9th, but I'm not 100% sure on that. However, extra attacks defies this rule. So for example, Mozrog Scragbat, he's got his Gut Ripper, but Chomper's Bite, or whatever the Squigosaw's Jaws, or whatever it's called, has the extra attacks ability. So instead of just using his Gut Ripper, I would equally be allowed to use Chomper's or Squigosaw's Jaws along with the Gut Ripper's attacks. However, if you have 2 attacks just regularly, and you had to make one, you would not be able to choose the second one because it does not have the extra attacks ability. Basically, extra attacks just allows you to take the attack you made and add on another attack that has the extra attacks ability. So basically, you can make 2 attacks with 2 different weapons instead of just making 1 attack with 1 weapon. But yeah, that is all the confusing rules that absolutely muddled my brain up to the maximum effect. But there's one more thing that I am really confused about in Warhammer, and I'm going to explain to you why on the next slide. One last thing that stumps me to my core about Warhammer 40k is why the Apothecary Biologus has a melee attack. What is he attacking with? Is he going to hit me over the head with his canister? That doesn't make any sense. In a term which Mozrog Scragbat, or Squiggo Boys, or Beast Boss, or Evotan, or any physical unit, even Space Marines, are charging into the Apothecary Biologus, what is he going to do? They've got chainsaws, whips, swords, overwatches. They've got these magical weapons in the Warhammer Fantasy world, and he's going to hit them over the head with a canister. This is what doesn't make sense, and this is what needs to be explained to me. But yes, that's all I wanted to rant about. I hope you really enjoyed this video, and hope I catch you in the next one.